In 1988, Soviet intelligence officers stationed in the Persian Gulf witnessed something that defied every calculation in their training manuals. Within 8 hours, the United States Navy located and destroyed half of the Iranian Navy without losing a single vessel. The Iranian ships simply vanished from the sea, struck by weapons they never saw coming, defended by systems they never detected. What you just saw was one file. The Cold War was fought in secrets like this. Cold War black files is where those stories resurface. Subscribe, new files declassified. But what haunted the Soviet observers wasn't the destruction itself. It was the blindness. While American forces moved with surgical precision, Soviet radars saw nothing but empty ocean and electronic noise. Their sensors, each designed to track everything from submarines to aircraft, registered only static and phantom signals. The Iranians fired missiles that spun in circles. They launched torpedoes that chased false targets. Their gunners aimed at coordinates where nothing existed. To understand what happened that day, you need to understand the decade that preceded it. The Iran-Iraq War had been raging since 1980, and by 1987, both nations were attacking neutral shipping in the Persian Gulf. Iranian forces, desperate to prevent Iraqi oil exports, began mining international waters and launching attacks on tankers from dozens of nations. The world's oil supply was at risk, and the United States decided to act. The American response was Operation Earnest Will, a convoy protection mission that would become the largest naval convoy operation since World War II. Their American warships began escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf, essentially daring Iran to attack vessels now flying the American flag. The Iranians, confident in their numerical advantage and Soviet-supplied equipment, accepted that dare. On April 14, 1988, the USS Samuel B. a guided missile frigate, was conducting routine patrol operations in the Gulf when it struck an Iranian mine. The explosion tore a 15-foot hole in the ship's hull, broke the keel, and flooded the engine room. 10 sailors were injured, some severely burned. Through heroic damage control efforts, the crew kept the ship afloat, but the message was clear. Iran was willing to attack American vessels directly. The decision came quickly from Washington. There would be retaliation, and it would be overwhelming. But the operation's true objectives went far beyond simple revenge. American military planners saw an opportunity to test systems and tactics that had been developed throughout the 1980s, electronic warfare capabilities that existed mostly in classified documents and training exercises. The Iranian Navy would provide the perfect laboratory. In the days before the operation, American intelligence assets mapped every element of Iran's naval presence in the Gulf. Satellite imagery provided ship locations. Radio intercepts revealed communication protocols. Electronic surveillance identified every radar frequency, every targeting system, every defensive sensor the Iranians possessed. The Americans built a complete electronic portrait of their enemy, while the Iranians remained completely unaware they were being studied. The Soviet intelligence officers, monitoring American communications and naval movements, noticed the unusual preparations. Ships moved into positions that made no tactical sense for a conventional engagement. Aircraft flew patterns that seemed designed for electronic mapping rather than combat patrol. The Soviets recognized the signatures of an impending operation but couldn't determine its exact nature or timing. The operation began before dawn on April 18th. Iranian naval forces controlled key shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, operating from platforms and vessels scattered across the Gulf. American planners knew every Iranian ship position, every radar frequency, every communication channel. The Iranians knew none of this. They believed their Soviet-supplied equipment made them invisible to Western detection, when they were catastrophically wrong. The first phase was purely electronic. American aircraft activated jamming systems that had never been used in actual combat. These weren't simple noise generators. They were sophisticated electronic warfare suites that could analyze enemy radar signals, identify their characteristics, and transmit precisely calibrated interference designed to confuse rather than simply blind. Iranian radar operators saw their screens fill with false targets, phantom ships and aircraft that appeared and disappeared randomly. The Iranians had trained for electronic warfare, but their training assumed jamming would be obvious, crude attempts to overwhelm their sensors. Instead, their radars showed what appeared to be legitimate targets, as some were actual American ships with their radar signatures amplified to appear larger and closer. Others were complete fabrications, ghost vessels generated by American electronic warfare aircraft orbiting beyond visual range. Iranian commanders tried to sort real from false and found the task impossible. When the first American missiles launched, Iranian radar operators saw nothing on their screens. No incoming threats, no aircraft, no ships beyond the horizon. Their radar dishes swept the sky, transmitting into a void that swallowed every pulse and returned nothing. The radar waves were being absorbed by American electronic countermeasures, or reflected back in patterns that made the missiles invisible to Iranian detection systems. Some operators thought their equipment had malfunctioned. Others suspected software errors. None realized they were staring at functioning systems that had been rendered useless by an invisible enemy. Technicians ran diagnostics and found everything operating within normal parameters. The equipment worked perfectly. It simply couldn't see what was there. American aircraft jammed Iranian communications with a precision that revealed just how thoroughly the Iranians had been penetrated. The jamming didn't affect all frequencies equally. It targeted specific channels the Iranians used for command and control, replacing orders with noise while leaving other frequencies clear. Iranian ships received orders that didn't exist, responded to threats that weren't there, and coordinated with phantom units. Ship captains tried to radio for support and heard only distortion. They switched to backup frequencies, and those were jammed within seconds, proving the Americans knew every communication protocol in advance. The Iranian frigate Sahand, one of the most modern vessels in their fleet, detected American aircraft approaching from the northeast. Her crew activated fire control radar, the system designed to guide their missiles to targets. The radar locked onto what appeared to be 2 American aircraft. The lock held for 3 seconds before dissolving into electronic noise. The crew reacquired the target. The lock broke again within 2 seconds. They tried a third time, switching to a different radar mode. Now the system showed 6 aircraft, where only 2 existed, each with slightly different range and bearing data. The fire control computer tried to prioritize targets and couldn't decide which readings were accurate, and the frustrated weapons officer ordered manual launch, firing missiles toward the approximate position of the enemy aircraft. The missiles launched successfully, their rocket motors igniting and propelling them skyward. But their own guidance systems were immediately jammed. The missiles, designed to home on reflected radar energy, found themselves pursuing signals that led them in wide circles. One missile actually curved back toward the Sahand itself before self-destructing. The others chased phantom targets until their fuel ran out and they dropped harmlessly into the Gulf. While the Sahand's crew struggled with their malfunctioning missiles, the real American aircraft had circled behind the ship, approaching from the southwest. The Iranian radar, focused on the phantom targets to the northeast, never detected the actual threat. The first indication the Sahand's crew had of the real attack was when American missiles struck the ship's superstructure, detonating with devastating effect. Soviet observers watching from their intelligence vessels saw none of this tactical detail. Their surveillance equipment, designed to monitor American naval operations throughout the Cold War, registered only anomalous readings. Radars showed scattered echoes that appeared and vanished randomly. Radio intercepts captured transmissions that started mid-sentence and cut off without warning. Direction-finding equipment pointed in impossible directions, suggesting American ships were broadcasting from multiple locations simultaneously or from positions they couldn't physically occupy. The Soviet analysts knew they were witnessing electronic warfare, but the sophistication exceeded anything in their own arsenal by what seemed like decades. They watched Iranian ships maneuver frantically against threats that didn't exist while ignoring real dangers approaching from unexpected vectors. They saw modern vessels, equipped with the same radar technology used throughout the Soviet Navy, reduced to firing blindly at the horizon or at coordinates where nothing existed. The oil platform Sasan, used by Iran as a military observation post, provided another demonstration of American electronic dominance. Iranian personnel on the platform operated radar and communication equipment identical to systems on Soviet installations throughout the world. American forces approached the platform and demanded its evacuation. The Iranians refused and opened fire with deck guns. American ships responded with naval gunfire, but what terrified the Soviet observers was how the Americans coordinated their attack. Multiple ships fired from different positions, their shells converging on the platform with timing that suggested precise electronic coordination. The Iranians tried to radio for air support, but their transmissions were jammed. They attempted to use backup communication systems, and those were jammed too, often within seconds of activation. Soviet intelligence officers realized the Americans weren't just jamming random frequencies. They were demonstrating the ability to identify and neutralize any communication system the moment it activated, suggesting real-time signal analysis and automated jamming response far beyond Soviet capabilities. The implications were staggering. If American forces could do this to Iranian military communications, they could do it to Soviet communications. Every radio, every data link, every command channel in the Soviet military was potentially vulnerable. The Iranian Navy attempted to coordinate a counterattack, ordering multiple vessels to converge on American positions. The orders were transmitted, received, and acknowledged. Ships began moving toward their assigned positions, but the coordinates they received had been subtly altered by American electronic warfare systems that had penetrated Iranian communication networks. Instead of converging on American ships, Iranian vessels sailed toward empty ocean, spacing themselves in patterns that made mutual support impossible. One Soviet intelligence officer, writing in a classified report weeks later, has described the psychological impact of watching this unfold. His equipment told him the battle was occurring in one location, while visual observation confirmed it was happening somewhere else entirely. Radar returns suggested American ships were moving at impossible speeds, sometimes appearing to occupy two positions simultaneously. The electronic picture and physical reality had separated completely, and he found himself unable to trust his own instruments. American forces moved through this chaos with perfect clarity. Their radar cut through their own jamming, identifying real targets while ignoring the phantom signals that confused the enemy. Their communications operated on frequencies and with encryption the Iranians couldn't touch. Their weapons struck targets the enemy couldn't see to defend. As guided by targeting data the enemy didn't know existed. The precision wasn't luck or superior firepower. It was information dominance so complete that the battle became a one-sided slaughter conducted by forces that could see everything against an enemy that was functionally blind. Iranian ships that attempted evasive maneuvers were tracked through electronic signatures they didn't know they were emitting. Vessels that tried to hide were located by radar returns they couldn't suppress. Units that attempted to maintain radio silence were pinpointed by the absence of their normal transmissions, their silence as revealing as their communications. The Iranian patrol boat Joshan made what would be remembered as one of the war's most futile attacks. Her crew detected American ships and fired a surface-to-surface missile, likely a Chinese-made silkworm. The missile launched successfully, but immediately began receiving guidance signals from multiple sources. American electronic warfare systems fed it contradictory targeting data, confusing its navigation computer. The missile flew erratically for several minutes before running out of fuel and crashing into the sea, never coming close to its intended target. American ships responded to the Joshan's attack with overwhelming force. Multiple vessels fired missiles simultaneously, coordinating their attack with precision that demonstrated networked warfare capabilities the Soviets hadn't imagined possible. The Joshan had no chance. Her defensive systems never detected the incoming missiles. Her crew never saw what killed them. Throughout the engagement, Soviet surveillance teams tried desperately to understand what they were witnessing. They knew American technology was advanced, but this went beyond incremental improvement. This was a fundamental revolution in warfare, the emergence of capabilities that made traditional military hardware almost irrelevant. A ship's guns, armor, and missiles meant nothing if its sensors were blind and its communications were severed. The Iranian Navy never had a chance to fight back effectively. Ships that tried to flee were tracked through multiple redundant systems. When Iranians disabled their radar to avoid detection, American forces tracked them by their engine signatures, their wake patterns, even the thermal emissions from their hulls. Every attempt to evade or hide failed because the Americans had sensors the Iranians didn't know existed, in operating in spectrums the Iranians couldn't access. Within 8 hours, half the Iranian fleet was gone, burning on the water or already beneath it. The American forces withdrew without losing a single ship. Iranian sailors who survived reported the surreal experience of fighting an enemy they never saw, whose weapons appeared without warning, whose defenses seemed impenetrable. Many described feeling helpless, shooting at empty ocean while their ships were systematically destroyed by an invisible enemy. Soviet naval intelligence understood immediately what they had witnessed. The United States hadn't simply won a battle through superior firepower or better tactics. They had demonstrated a capability that rendered traditional naval warfare obsolete. All the Soviet vessels in the Persian Gulf, all the destroyers and frigates and cruisers equipped with the same basic systems the Iranians used, would be equally helpless against an American attack. The Soviet Navy's surface fleet, the product of decades of construction and billions of rubles in investment, was functionally worthless against an enemy who controlled the electromagnetic spectrum so completely. Reports flowed back to Moscow in unprecedented detail. Admirals read descriptions of sensors that couldn't sense, weapons that couldn't target, and communications that couldn't communicate. They absorbed accounts of Soviet-designed equipment failing completely while American systems operated flawlessly in the same environment. They studied intelligence assessments suggesting the Americans had been operating at perhaps 70% of their actual capability and holding back their most advanced systems for a real conflict. The implications cascaded through every level of Soviet military planning. In any naval conflict with the United States, Soviet ships would be fighting blind against an enemy who saw everything. But the problem extended far beyond naval warfare. If American electronic warfare could blind an entire navy, what could it do to Soviet air defenses? To tank battalions that relied on radio coordination? To missile launch systems that depended on radar targeting? To the command and control networks that held the entire Soviet military together? The response in Moscow was immediate and desperate. Resources poured into electronic warfare research and development. Engineers studied the captured data from the Persian Gulf, trying to reverse engineer capabilities they could barely comprehend. Research teams worked to develop countermeasures, jamming systems, hardened communications. But the gap was too wide, the technology too far advanced. Soviet electronics lagged years, perhaps decades, behind American development. Closing that gap would require time and technological infrastructure they didn't have. More importantly, Soviet leadership realized the same advantage likely existed across every domain of modern warfare. American satellites probably saw Soviet military movements with clarity Soviet intelligence could only imagine. American aircraft probably flew with stealth characteristics that made them invisible to Soviet radar. American missiles probably incorporated guidance systems immune to Soviet jamming. The entirety of Soviet military planning, based on numerical superiority and massed firepower, was potentially obsolete against an enemy who could see everything while remaining invisible. Economic realities made the situation worse. The Soviet Union was already straining under the cost of maintaining military parity with the West. Matching American electronic warfare capabilities would require massive investment in semiconductor manufacturing, computer technology, satellite systems, research and development across dozens of fields. The money didn't exist. The technological base didn't exist. The educational infrastructure to train the necessary engineers and scientists barely existed. Senior Soviet military officials, reading the intelligence assessments from the Persian Gulf, reached a conclusion that few dared speak openly. In the most crucial dimension of modern warfare, the electromagnetic spectrum, they weren't just behind, they were lost. The gap was unbridgeable with existing resources and technology. Any major conflict with the United States would likely end in catastrophic Soviet defeat, not through nuclear exchange, but through conventional warfare so asymmetric it would resemble a massacre. Operation Praying Mantis lasted 8 hours on a single day in April 1988. But the electronic warfare lessons it taught would influence military planning for decades. American forces had demonstrated capabilities that redefined possible in modern combat. They had shown that information dominance could be more decisive than firepower, that control of the electromagnetic spectrum could render an enemy functionally helpless regardless of their courage or numbers. For the Soviet Union, that those 8 hours represented something more profound than a military defeat in a regional conflict. They represented confirmation of a terrible suspicion that had been growing for years. The Cold War was ending, and the Soviet Union had already been defeated by an enemy who could make them blind while remaining invisible. The demonstrations of force, the military parades, the thousands of tanks and aircraft and ships, all of it was theatre. When actual modern warfare occurred, when electronics and information dominated the battlefield, the Soviet military was obsolete. Just over a year after Operation Praying Mantis, the Berlin Wall fell. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Many factors contributed to that collapse: economic failure and political reform and nationalist movements. But in the minds of Soviet military leadership, the outcome had been decided that day in the Persian Gulf, when they watched their equipment fail and their doctrine crumble against an enemy who had already won a war. The Soviets didn't fully understand they were fighting.